Hi, Brad.
Aha. Hi, Jason.
How are you?
Success. Yeah, great. Well,
Awesome.
you definitely win best backdrop, and that's not one of those virtual ones either, I imagine, right?
No, this is the real
It,
deal.
yeah, yeah. Looks amazing.
We can go
So,
walk in my weedy vineyard whenever you're ready.
that
Oh, hey,
would be
Shane Foster just jumped on. Hey, Shane.
that'd be yeah, new and interesting use for Instagram Live, some sort of yeah, virtual vineyard walk. I bet people would love that actually.
Well, we can do it if you want to. I'm portable.
I think baby steps for the first session.
All right then.
Yeah. So I guess we'll give everybody because it looks like people are still connecting. So maybe
Yeah.
we'll take a couple minutes and let the crowd roll in. But so how are you doing today? It's have you got buds out or what's the status in Oregon?
Well, let's go look. Um, hey, before we get started, Brad,
Yeah.
we've only talked on Twitter, so I don't really know how to pronounce your last name.
Like the color and then tricks. So gray tricks.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. So here, let me give you a little bud zoom in here. So that's about
Oh
the stage
wow.
we're at right now.
Yeah.
Let's see.
And
So they
wow,
just came up.
nice and even. And
Yeah, we'll start
weather-wise,
flipping off,
is SE high
flicking the
SE.
secondaries off the vine here soon.
And are you in terms of weather? I don't know whether it's
And the other question I
safe
have
to
for you, Brad.
mention. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, what was your accent? It seems like very Western English.
So yeah, born and raised in Canada. Been in England for 13 years now, but yeah, grew up in Canada. Actually, my wife's also Canadian.
Okay,
She's from not so far away from you on Vancouver Island. And she's
all
when
right.
I can't hear the accent, but when people meet us together, they tend to assume she's Canadian and I'm American, but yeah, don't know. So um, anyway,
Well,
I
I heard
think
your oot, so
yeah. Okay, yeah. There's me now trying to be two words ahead of myself for everything that I say now for the rest of our talk. So yeah, thank you for agreeing to this. Even though as you said, we've only ever exchanged words on Twitter. But I thought in this age where everybody's doing everything virtual, um, I my most interesting chats I think in the wine industry are with other winemakers, and I was thinking it might be fun to set something up like that. And your name was the first one that popped into my mind as somebody that I'd love to have a chat with. Ideally, the first one would have been, probably in a pub over a pint or something like that. But here we are making do in the yeah in this current era that we're in. So yeah, do you want to do a little introduction of yourself and your vineyard, and then I'll do the same, and then we'll dive in.
sure, sure. Well, Jason Lett, my last name is easy to pronounce. The name of my winery is not though. It's the Irie Vineyards. So and Irie is a hawk's nest, and my mom was an English major, and so she knows fancy old English words like the word for hawk's nest, and so she named the vineyard for the family of hawks that was living above the the baby vines as they were planting.
Oh wow,
And I think I already said I'm Jason Lett, so I'm the second generation winemaker at Irie. I took over from my dad in 2005. That was my first vintage as winemaker, but of course I'd worked many vintages before that, just as general labor.
yeah. And I mean, your vineyard was the first, if I'm not mistaken, to put Pinot Noir in the ground in Oregon. Is that right? I got that right?
Not in Oregon. So there was a fellow named Richard Summer who came up in 1961 and who planted Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Gewürztraminer, Riesling in southern Oregon in the Umpqua Valley in 1961. But the Willamette Valley, which is now where the majority of the grapes are grown in our area, was pioneered by my dad in 1965, and then
Yeah,
some of his schoolmates shortly after.
yeah. Oh, amazing. And what was
Yeah.
what was the was it um, planting in the Willamette back then? Was it just undiscovered territory, or was it that at the time people didn't think that Pinot could ripen in that area? Do you think?
It's interesting. He had some professors. He went to the University of California, Davis, and fell in love with not necessarily Pinot Noir as a variety, but with Burgundy. And there's he started looking at the climates and just realizing there were very few climates analogous with Burgundies outside of Burgundy, and the Willamette Valley was one of the very few. And so when he kind of announced his plans to his professors to come up here, uh, Harold Berg, who was a viticulture guy, was really encouraging, and some of the other professors weren't so much. I think one of them told him that he was going to get athlete's foot up to his knees if he moved to Oregon.
Yeah. and but since then, I guess it's Willamette's. Well, it's probably a giant understatement to say it's totally surpassed the Umpqua Valley. Is that right? Or where what were the two trajectories in terms of territories?
Yeah, I guess planted acreage. So Oregon's shaped like a big rectangle, basically, and in the west half of it, there's two mountain ranges. There's the Cascade Mountain Range, and then behind me, the Coast Range. And so the valleys between these two mountain ranges. And that's where all the grapes in Oregon are planted from north to south. So from north, you have the Willamette Valley, then the Umpqua Valley, and at the very southern end, the Rogue Valley. And so it's about 80% of the grapes in the Willamette Valley, about 15 in the Umpqua, and about 5 in the Rogue.
Oh, wow. And so not quite analogous, but maybe similar. We have in the south of England where we've got our vines planted. There's the South Downs, which is a ridge running east-west across at least the part of the country where we have our vines. And the job
Mm-hmm.
they do for us is to protect the vines from prevailing weather coming off the English Channel. Have you got the mountains doing the same job for you? I imagine from the west, yes, but maybe not from the east.
Well, let's see. I might swivel around again. I don't, we can't really see the Cascades because of the clouds, but yeah, all the weather comes from the west behind me. And on the other side of those mountains, which are not terribly far away, only about 70 kilometers, you know, 40 miles. Um, on the other side of those mountains, they get 12 feet of rain a year, and we get 40
Wow.
inches.
Yeah, yeah,
So that's, 4 meters as opposed to one, basically.
yeah,
So those mountains scrape off a lot of the water and protect us from a lot of what's going on in the Pacific. And then on the
yeah.
other side, to the east of us, are the Cascade Mountains. And on the other side of those mountains is like a continental interior. It's literally a desert, um, about 8 inches of rain a year. So I don't know, what is that, about 12 centimeters or something?
Yeah.
Uh,
No, two and
20
a half.
centimeters?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
20 centimeters. Yeah, yeah,
um, but extremely huge temperature fluctuations. So in the winter, it can be 30 degrees below 0 centigrade, and in the summer, it can be 42. And so it's way too extreme and way too dry for growing grapes over there. So we're protected from that extreme climate by the Cascade Range,
yeah.
which, if it's not inconveniently blowing up, is a great boon to viticulture here.
And yeah, so a classic valley shape. Like, is there a preferential planting? So you want to be to the east, to the west, or facing east,
Well,
facing west with the vines, or not so much?
uh, really south facing, like what we see behind
Okay.
me, uh, and west were considered better in the 70s when things were cooler, but now that things are warming, you see people planting on more northern slopes and preferring eastern slopes. You see people orienting their vineyards differently so that the rows are oriented east-west, and so that the sun is rising and passing over the top of the vines rather than shining on the sides of them.
Yeah.
And so you see a lot of responses to global warming. Oh, and people are planting at higher elevations now. Um, Traditionally the east side of the valley was too cool to ripen grapes, and because of the what they call the adiabatic cooling, the effect is as the clouds lift, they dump their rain on the east side of the valley as they go over the Cascades. Um, and so that's always been a little bit of a hostile area, but people are starting to make inroads over there. So things are changing.
Yeah. Yeah. We've got kind of the opposite situation to a lot of places in England, that we're doing what we can in order to find the warm spots. So for us, that I think that the trendy thing that you normally see mentioned on back labels for wines from Argentina and things like that is how high they are. 900 meters. Oh, that must be you know amazing. We're exactly the opposite in England, that everybody wants to be as low as possible, and we sort of have uh, well, the viticulture equivalent of a glass ceiling. No one really wants to go above, say, 125 meters above sea level, because we're all sort of keeping our proverbial heads down, sheltering from wind mainly, but also that just the higher you go, the cooler it gets. So
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. Where I'm sitting
so
used to be considered sort of the top end of where you could ripen grapes in the valley at 280 meters. And now we're seeing plantings much higher than that.
yeah, yeah, wow. Um, One of the things I was really curious to ask you about is I'm sure I heard that when your vines first went in the ground, that they were own rooted. Is that, have I got that right? And do you still have any own rooted vines around?
Yeah, everything behind me is own rooted. Um, we can, most of the wine that goes into the bottle in our estate is still own rooted. And we definitely have phylloxera present. It's, definitely taking its toll, but it's moving much more slowly here than it did in Europe. So at least we have some time to react and plant.
Yeah. So is that then? Is there anyone? So in response, is there anyone changing over to rootstocks, or is that just? I imagine there's some new vineyards being planted now where people go straight onto rootstock, but
Yeah, I don't
is
think
that the
anyone's planted
solution?
on their own roots since 1991,
So
or 92. That's when we first really saw it come into the valley. And I think all the vineyards that have been developed since are on rootstock. So really, a remnant vineyard like this one behind me that's on its own roots is probably less than 1% of the planted acreage in the state.
yeah. Oh wow. And so then do you have? Can you? Uh, is Yeah. Have you seen the rootstock effect? I mean, I've never had the chance to uh, see anything other than vines on rootstock and wines that come off rootstock. How how things change by bone roots versus um, the grafts.
Um, yeah, definitely. Own-rooted vines seem to be a little bit more water efficient than grafted vines, and so that, of course, changes the way the grapes themselves ripen. But it's hard for me to do a direct comparison between own-rooted um, and grafted because all of our grafted vines, it's about 20% of our estate now is grafted. All of those vines are young, and so it's hard to tease
Yeah,
apart whether the differences are young vine, old vine, or if they're grafted, ungrafted.
yeah, yeah. No, it's sort of what I think. One of the things that makes this whole thing so interesting is, I mean, grape growing and wine making is that where it's a constant iterative evolution. There's no way to really untangle a single factor, but um, but yeah, I've only ever been around grafted vines, so I was curious about that. And also, I think when I first, I should have said, my wife Sherry and I, we after we did our winemaking training, we did two vintages around the world, and one of the places we stopped was in Oregon. So I worked to harvest at Domaine Serene, and Sherry was across the road at Domaine Druin.
Uh-huh.
Which, in terms of experience and covering, the spectrum, they make good counterpoints. Those two had very interesting experiences. But that was my first exposure to uh, hearing about own rooted vines and phylloxera, and I think coming into that, I always thought, I just imagined that own rooted vines, you get phylloxera, and the next season that's it. Your vine and your vineyard is finished. But that I learned there that it's actually, yeah, like you said, it's sort of a slow evolution. There is decline, I guess, but it's not something that you need to be fearful of, I suppose, as an instant, as with an instant consequence.
Yeah, it's definitely a very sort of, you know, ugh, it's a terrible metaphor. It's cancer. It's not a car accident, you know. Um,
Yeah.
but it's sad in that same way, you have to say goodbye to those vines, and I've grown up with a lot of these, so uh, it's hard.
I
Um,
suppose root stocks have killed off any motivation for people to try to find a way to get around to treat phylloxera. If there's something, some way to manage it so that their effect would be lessened, or they go away, move to another crop or something.
yeah, phylloxera and grapevines are so co-evolved that I don't think phylloxera can move to another crop. Um, I think Boston ivy is susceptible to it or something. There's like a couple things in the Rhamnaceae, the same family as grapes, that get it, but phylloxera is really specialized for grapes, and they've been in continuous warfare for millions of years. And phylloxera has something like, they're still counting 27 different expressions of its life cycle.
Oh,
Like if it
wow.
has to, go from a bug that crawls underground to one that flies through the air, yeah, sure, I'll do that. They reproduce both sexually and asexually. They're like a demonic foe. Um, but but research in phylloxera basically stopped 100 years ago. Once, well, more than that, 120 years ago, once the rootstock sort of grafting solution was discovered to protect, Vitis vinifera against phylloxera, the research stopped.
Yeah.
There's a few systemic insecticides that I've heard of people using, but as you can see from behind me here, we're pretty organic, so that wouldn't work for us.
Yeah. Yeah.
I tried spreading crab shells around to encourage chitin eating predators to come into the vineyard and consume the phylloxera. And what happened the next year was a giant burst of phylloxera. So I think I just fed the little buggers.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, good
Yeah.
intentions gone wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it you I guess making some special segregation, are you, of the vines, the own rooted vines, just in terms of how you harvest them and handle the wines? Do they still go somewhere special relative to the other plots, or is it not such a clean break?
It is a clean break just because most of what I've planted so far, or let me say this, most of what's come online so far are varieties that are new. Uh, so Pinot Meunier, Trousseau,
Yeah.
Melon de Bourgogne. Uh, we always grew Chardonnay, and so we have more of that. We always grew Pinot Meunier and Melon de Bourgogne too, but we just finally now have sort of marketable quantities of that. Um, so I don't have a significant planting of Pinot Noir on rootstock yet. That's giving us fruit. So that's going to be very interesting when that happens.
Yeah. Yeah. I just saw a question scroll by.
Yeah.
I missed the name, but from Wayne Street. Jason, can you talk about why you don't turn the soil?
Oh, yeah. So if we look behind me here, you'll see that um, this is a vineyard planted in 1974, and we haven't plowed this vineyard since 80, 81. Um, and so we have a really rich species composition around each vine. Vines are super dependent on these relationships that they have with soil fungus to get their mineral. We talk about minerality in wine and we think it comes from the rock,
Yeah.
but it actually comes from this interaction between the vines and the bacteria and fungus around them. And so my feeling about this is that if we, leave a really complex, uh, diverse soil ecosystem on the top of the soil, that we're encouraging a really complex, diverse ecosystem below the soil. Um, and those mycorrhiza, they're called mycorrhiza, do another thing too, which is they act as an internet. They act as a way for plants to communicate with each other. They can send hormonal signals through these mycelial networks, and so when you're cutting the soil, you're actually cutting those connections, and they're important for plant immune response. If you have a bug coming into a forest, the trees can tell each other, "Hey, the beetles are coming," and they can, make more tannin as a response, for example, to reduce predation. So I try to keep those relationships as intact as possible in the vineyard, given that it's an agricultural system and that some disturbance is always required. The disturbance we do here is just to mow, though, so that really, you know, biases what's growing in the vineyard towards. Uh, just checking out that question. Um, Towards grasses. So that's mostly what you see in the vineyard.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a yeah, well, complex system as you said, but also probably complex to set up and to adapt your way of working. Has it been kind of a slow evolution to get you to the step that you're at now, or were there years where it was, big step change and then some smaller changes and then another big move and then smaller changes?
Um, you know, they weren't really doing any research on mycorrhiza until the early 1980s, but my dad was like moving away from plowing in the early 1970s. So he must have had some sort of intuitive sense that something was going on there. Um, I almost wonder if he wasn't doing it just to get the roots deeper, instead of being in competition with the grasses and things at the top level of the soil. If you let the grasses grow, that makes the roots go down where they can get better sources of water.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I found it to be an awkward transition when I'm planting vineyards, though, because it's hard to know when to move a freshly developed vineyard from tillage, which is really essential when the vines are young, to stopping that. That's been a hard thing to find, and rootstocks are making that more complicated.
Right. Yeah. Um, Questions, if I a question scrolled by as you were talking, if I can paraphrase, essentially that with Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier, you've got all the ingredients for a traditional method sparkling. Any plans for that?
I made a traditional method sparkling in uh, from the 2009 and 2011 vintages. Those were the base wines, but it was all Pinot Meunier. Uh, I think my dad planted those three varieties. He knew roughly that Pinot Noir and Chardonnay were going to work in the Willamette Valley, but I don't think he knew exactly whether it would be more of a Burgundian expression or a more Champenois-like expression. And so I think he planted those three just in case,
Yeah.
the future of the Willamette Valley was actually sparkling wine instead of still wine. And
But
you have all three varieties too, right?
yeah, so we're about 20 years behind Irie, I guess, in our pioneering sense. But we were the first to plant, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier in England exclusively for traditional method sparkling.
Uh-huh.
And England, well, it was a lot of skepticism back. This was in 1988. Our first vines went in the ground, and a lot of skepticism at the time that Chardonnay would ever just couldn't ripen, couldn't ripen in England. So we were far from the first winemakers in the UK, but a lot more, let's say, pragmatic viticulture with hybrids that were, disease resistant and ripen early, etc. But the Mosses, actually an American couple, Stuart and Sandy Moss,
Uh-huh.
from Chicago, owned the Nightingale estate at the time, and they had done their research on climate, and they'd heard this trend that or news that the soil in the south of England was very similar to Champagne, so um, those varieties ought to work, and we can make a traditional method sparkling. And they went for it. Had about 8 years between first vines going in the ground and first release of wine. So from 1988 to 1996, but from early days, some successes in on the awards, at awards shows, which is important, like for a new wine region. Don't need them so much once you're more established, but in the early days, winning those international awards are really helpful to kind of help convince people to try these wines, and little by little away we went, and later with more and more producers. So nowadays English sparkling and those three varieties are just growing at a staggering rate. I think if you look at the plantings of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir in England over the last 10 years, that even steeper slope than like the share price of Amazon or Apple or one of those guys. Yeah, it's grown tremendously.
So I think it's interesting that we have an analogy and that we, both work for pioneering estates, but that we came in probably, I don't know when you started, but I didn't start as winemaker until 25 years after our first vintage. Wait, 25? Ooh, 35. So what are your reflections on sort of what it's like to uphold a legacy and push it forward?
Yeah, good question. It's
Small
I
thing.
think I think yeah I think we've always kept a really open mind. So fortunate that when my wife and I arrived at Night Timber, there was the owners, the previous owners had kept back a good selection of all the wines, so we could get a good sense of what had been done and what was tried and where things were going. But we've always kept an open mind that every day somebody new, well, maybe not even every day in the early days, but often we're making first impressions, that people are hearing about English wine for the first time, trying English wine for the first time, hopefully trying Night Timber, and that got to never lose focus, or have any complacency. That's the we're doing a job for a category, not just for Night Timber. To that, if someone on a speculative chance sits down at a restaurant in London or somewhere, and let's the sommelier convinces them to try an English sparkling wine as something new for them. The first bottle is easy to sell, I guess, because of the niche or the novelty value, but wanting to make sure that we over deliver in every sense, to make sure that they have a good experience and can come back to England. And I think that's sort of one side of it. But then on the other side of things, it's also being humble enough, I guess, and that to not try and keep ourselves humble enough to not assume that we know everything or know too much, to lock things down. So there's a lot of discussion. Maybe you have this or you've been through this in Oregon, but a lot of discussion to lock things down in terms of let's set up regulations, and let's use the rule book to tightly define what's allowed and what's not allowed, and what styles are good and what styles are not good. And
Mm-hmm.
we've been doing this for a long time. Night Timber's been around for more than 30 years, and Sherry and I have almost done half of the vintages at Night Timber, but still we're learning. Still every year, taking things and looking back at what we've done, and how can we improve a little bit. And so I think that's that's an important thing when you're pioneering or out in front, is not to lock things down too quickly, because probably if we had to write such a rule book back in 2007 or 2008 when we first arrived, it wouldn't be much use to us these days.
It's interesting that you say that you feel like your wine isn't just representing Night Timber, but it's representing a category of English wine. I think one of the reasons that Oregon has been successful is because a lot of the pioneering families took that same attitude, So I'm not just making wine for myself. I'm making wine that represents the region as a whole, and I have to be extra diligent to make sure that what I'm putting out there represents the region well. Is
Yeah.
that a widespread sort of feeling in the sparkling wine community in England?
Oh yeah, I think there is that good feeling, and everyone's so proud of being a part of English wine. I mean, it just has this gravitational pull that's drawing people in that are there because they love it, not just because it's they grew up in a certain town and it's a job they could do, but actually they're there for the passion. So I think everybody's working really hard in that sense, and there's also new opportunities coming up all the time, new markets and things like that. So where there's kind of a commercial pressure as well to be doing things well and to try and stay at the front because there's so many good players around now, good producers around that you've got to be on your game. But a good example of the category representation is kind of a sad story to begin with. But in 2012, we had such a cold and wet summer in the south of England. Apart from the 2 weeks, London Olympics were in 2012. So while the tourists were around, we had beautiful weather and showed off the country wonderfully. But as soon as they left, on turned the rain taps, and away went the sun, and we never saw it again until after harvest. So we decided, we only make wine from vineyards that we own, and we decided we're not going to make, because we didn't get the ripeness that we wanted, and with quality in mind, we're not going to make any wine this year. And we left all the fruit on the vine, and we had a bit of interest. Once we made the announcement, we're not going to pick anything this year. A bit of interest for people phoning us up saying, hey, I wouldn't mind to buy those grapes off you. And the owner, Eric Karima, he said, we're not going to do that because Night Timber at the time, one of the bigger producers in terms of hectares. So it's a decent amount of grapes that we're talking about. And he said, somebody's going to buy these grapes, turn it into 6-pound bottle of English sparkling wine, and it's gonna be on the market in a couple of years, and just this drag us all down and have this big batch of wine that we know isn't of a high enough quality. That's going to drag the whole category down. So I mean, we at Night Timber and therefore the owner Eric Karima swallowed that whole cost as a pretty big thing.
That's a giant thing.
Yeah, I
So,
hope to never have to go through that again, because it's a marginal climate over here. So every season seems to have something about it, whether it's a spring frost or just a late start, or rain at the wrong time. We're always battling something viticulturally, but it
mhm.
always seems to come good. And we knew in 2012 that this isn't tracking well, but it always comes good. So it will come good. And we eventually got to the point just before. I mean, at the time that we needed to go out and start getting grapes, that we said this isn't going to work, and having to go. And we even had the harvest interns with us by then, and having to go and make the announcement to them. My voice is warbling. I'm really sorry, but we're not going to be making any wine this year. Yeah, that
Unbelievable.
was tough. And then so there's that emotional time at harvest, and then you kind of get over it. And with sparkling, there's always stuff to do with riddling, disgorging, and vintages that you have aging on lees. But so kind of got used to it, and then you go to have a Christmas break, and then come back. And normally, as soon as we get back to work in January is when start tasting all the base wines,
Hmm.
and start thinking about blends and how things are going to be put together, and just walk into the winery with empty tanks, and that was the second wave. So
That's painful.
yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
what's been your biggest surprise or revelation as you've, worked half the vintages at Night Timber? Is it a soil thing? Is it a climate thing? Is it a clone thing?
Um, I'm not so excited about clones. I think clones are useful, important part of the story, or they, they're a contributor, but you could never just take take the list of clones that we use and make a wine that tastes like night timber. There's too many other factors that chip into it. But I think what I'm impressed with is just, even though the climate is it is difficult. It's cool. There's some summers the temperature never crosses 30 degrees. Uh, it can be wet, although a lot of people, when they talk about the amount of rainfall that we have in England annually, it looks pretty wet. But during the growing season, it's not that bad. We're not so different. I think we're within 10% maybe of Champagne, for example, in terms of growing season rainfall. Annual much higher, but not
Right.
so not so stressful if it rains in December. Um, but just that the growing season, the combination of factors seems to, by default, put the wines in a pretty good position. If you've got a good site, good the right sort of grape varieties planted, you're going to end up with something already pretty decent. And then how much work you put into it after that. So, and that means, in the vineyard and in the winery, careful pressing and how you handle the fermentations and how you put the blends together. That's when you add all the first 80% or 85% comes pretty easily by having your vines in the right place, and then it's three times as much work to go from 85 up to the top tier. But it's I think just how well suited these grapes are for sparkling wine, that it really is, I think, the most exciting place to be making sparkling wine in the world. Grass is, I suppose literally and figuratively, greener on this side,
Uh-huh.
so to speak.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
it's interesting, kind of thinking about sort of what you're dealing with. Is champagne, you know, okay, when people are trying to compliment my wines, they'll say they're Burgundian, and I always like, yes, thank you very much, because
Yeah.
I'd rather they tasted like Oregon.
Yeah.
I understand that they mean it as a nice thing, but I also want it to taste like here. So
Yeah.
do you does Night Timber get compared to Champagne, and how do you deal with that when people make that comparison?
Yeah, really, really good question, and definitely that comes up. But how I've kind of, because I'm exactly the same. I have exactly the same reaction, that if someone said, "Oh, it's very champagne-like," well, thanks, but I'd rather it was, English-like or Night Timber-like. And we own all of our own vineyards, and we try we do everything that we can in the winery to have the vineyards show through in the wines, and that's kind of a rare thing in sparkling wine, to be talking about soil and terroir. But how I've sort of reconciled that what I agree with you that it's intended as a compliment. How I've sort of reconciled that in my mind is that people just don't have a lot of experience with tasting a lot of sparkling wines from around the world. And for a long time, Champagne owned the territory of high quality sparkling wine. So in a blind tasting context, um, if you tried a sparkling wine and you liked it, you'd say, "Oh, it's probably from Champagne." And if you didn't like it, you'd say, "It's probably from England or somewhere else." So it's kind of a proxy. How I take it, it's kind of a proxy for this. This is a good sparkling wine. I like it, because
Eh,
there aren't that many people that have enough tasting experience, to be able to pinpoint exactly, the characters, the characters of an English sparkling wine versus a champagne, for example. Not even mentioning, there's 330 million bottles of champagne, everything from 5 pounds up to 500 plus pounds on, lots of different soils, different grape combinations, different vinifications. So what's the taste of champagne? It's pretty hard to define.
yeah. Hey,
So
I noticed a question pop up here, and I'm going to answer it, but then I'm going to tip it to you as well. So somebody asked, uh, what Ivory wine is my favorite wine to drink, and I make 22 wines, so I have a hard time making the decision. So I'm going to ask what they're making for dinner, and then I'll bring the wine. How does that sound? And I would I would ask you, how do you respond when people ask you what's your favorite wine?
It's yeah, in the same sort of way actually. You know, there's the cliche expression. You know, it's like trying to choose your favorite child. Try to avoid that one. But it does matter. You know, like if someone was serving let's say duck, you know, for a meal, rosé would be a great match.
Hmm.
Our Blanc de Blanc, 100% Chardonnay, you'd have to, you know, you'd be shoehorning that into the occasion. So why not, you know, choose, you know, what the experience kind of influences what would show best or be the most enjoyable on that occasion. We you know we have this um, desire. You know, we really want to do something special at Night Timber, and you know, as an extreme example, the 2012 harvest where we culled the whole thing. So we you know we try and only do make wines that are good and that are worth drinking, and they're going to be enjoyable. So things that are in our portfolio. We don't have 22, we have 7. But you know the wines that are in our portfolio, they're all there for a reason. You know there's a story behind how they came about and why they're there. So I think if one was perennially a favorite or perennially not a favorite, well, particularly if it was perennially not a favorite, it probably would fall by the wayside at some point. But fortunately, we're not in that position.
Um,
That's a good question.
yeah. Well, and Shane is following up with some specifics here. Uh,
Okay.
what what night timber wine would you pair with scallops, and what would you pair with lamb? And then I'll respond with an Irie combo.
Scout. Well, actually, the two wines that I mentioned. So Blanc de Blanc is
Hmm.
absolutely sings with scallops. Great with a lot of lighter and sort of medium weight shellfish dishes.
Hmm.
Lamb is tricky with sparkling wine, but depending on how it's prepared, sometimes our sparkling rosé can work. There's a little bit more structure with that. We make it by blending in a small portion of red wine into white base wine, and so you get a little bit of body and a little bit of structure from that red, and that can sometimes with certain lamb dishes, but it's risking tipping over into too strong of flavors for sparkling wine.
Yeah,
So go for it.
um, sometimes like a tartare preparation with red meat can work well with lighter wines. Let's
Yeah.
see, scallops. I'm going to go for Melon de Bourgogne. Um, I aged the Melon de Bourgogne for 2 years in neutral oak on the lees, and so um, it comes out with just a slightly oxidative note, but also really full mid palate. So it's great with scallops. Um, and lamb is a shoe in for Pinot Noir. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's just a classic combination. Um, let's see, I have 5 vineyards. If I'm going to pick a vineyard for lamb, I'd probably go for the outcrop. It has some sweetness, which can pair well with the slight gaminess that you get from lamb. And just to go off on a tangent, if it's something really gamey like venison, then Pinot Meunier is just an amazing combo.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I could see that actually.
Yeah.
Um,
And I saw
the
Juliet Pope popped on too. Hi, Juliet.
um, the something you reminded me actually something that I heard you say on Levi Dalton's podcast actually when you were interviewed there. You said you think so. Pinot Noir has this reputation for being, you know, really tough to grow and really fickle in the vineyard and thin-skinned, et cetera, et cetera. But you think that Chardonnay is even tougher than Pinot Noir, and I wanted to hear a little bit more about that.
Well, for us, Chardonnay takes a lot of extra attention because it's prone to both powdery mildew and botrytis to a greater extent than Pinot Noir.
Yeah,
And so we have to train it more carefully than Pinot Noir. And then in the winery, it takes all the same barrel work as Pinot Noir. And then at the end, the process of getting it to bottle, I find is trickier. A lot of accounts won't accept a slight amount of cloudiness in a white wine where they will in a red. And so, Chardonnay to be marketable requires filtration and to filter correctly, you really just have to have such a light touch. So I find Chardonnay to be, just all around more work. Uh,
Yeah.
but I really appreciate Chardonnay and its ability to reflect place. It's something that I, man, we could talk for hours, but
Yeah. Yeah.
Chardonnay
Yeah.
is so like malleable that a lot of winemakers are really tempted to make Chardonnay. And I think if you can just keep your hands off it and just the interventions that you make be the lightest ones possible, it's a incredibly transparent vessel for showing place.
Yeah. Yeah. 100% agree. Actually, we have the extra challenge with Chardonnay that it has a longer growing season than Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and in England, we have fairly early bud burst beginning of April, and then sometimes not picking until the middle of October, and we don't have any room to push that back. It's not like if we were in the Barossa and not quite ripe enough, give it 2 more weeks and you'll get there. Yeah, and end of October, it's going to be frost and 7.5 hours of daylight, and there's nothing to be gained by having fruit on the vine. So Chardonnay gives us that challenge as well. Yeah, I totally agree about how well it can just show its origins, and for us as well, vintage. So our Blanc de Blanc is vintage dated. We do some wines that are multi-vintage
Mm.
style, but Blanc de Blanc is always vintage dated, and
Hmm.
along with a couple of other wines, but the BB in particular just shows so well, captures so well, how that year unfolded and the key parts of the year. So yeah, I love it for that. But it's interesting what you say about winemakers being tempted to, wanting to do something. I suppose you got to earn the name that's on your business card, earn the title that's on your business card. But Sherry has an expression. She's, because that there is that temptation. I think it's something about being human, or that to want to mess and meddle and get your thumbprint on it. And she says, whenever you feel that compulsion to really, you have to do something, go have a cup of tea. That can be the thing that you do. Stay away from the wine. Just let it be. And if you have to do something, then go put the kettle on. And
Yep.
with Chardonnay, that more often than not, that tends to be the right approach if you've looked after things in the vineyard. So
Yeah. My dad he had some medical training before he went into wine, and his favorite rostrum for a problem wine was what he called the tincture of time. Just
right, yeah,
don't touch it. I like the idea of drinking a cup of tea. Sometimes, tea time might last a year, but you'll get something better by giving it a little bit more time to sort itself out.
yeah, yeah. I think if you've looked after things well, if it's balanced in a way going into bottle, then those wines, even if they wobble from time to time, they do tend to come around.
Is this person Manny Greatrix any relation of yours, Brad?
That is my mom. Hi,
Oh,
mom.
hi, mom. It's awesome.
Yeah, yeah. So that's thrown me off now. What
Uh,
do I say to my mom?
right, the pressure's on now.
Yeah.
Um, what if we close on Pinot Meunier? I'd be interested in your observations of Pinot Meunier and what it brings to a champagne blend.
We love it. It's never gets the same amount of headlines as Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. Certainly not in England, but it's a super important grape for us. We've grown. So we started with, by area, we were about 6 to 7% Pinot Meunier when Sherry and I started, and I timber are up to 18% now.
Nice.
Gets used in our classic cuvee and sometimes in our rosé, and it just all I think all three of the grapes for try the main grapes for traditional method sparkling wine kind of fit in different parts of the palate. They sort of, to give it, complete mouthfeel is filled out by different parts are filled out by each of the grapes. And Pinot Meunier does that job of just giving a great round shape. I mean, a blend that has the right amount of Pinot Meunier in it just has a wonderful generosity. Plus, it's very fruit forward. A lot of interesting red fruit, apricots, etc. as a base wine,
Mhm.
and it matures. something about the phenolic profile of the grape, but it tends to mature a little bit more quickly than Pinot Noir in bottle. So it brings a complexity. You know, starts as you're aging on lees. If you're getting into 2.5 and 3 years, starting into the serious amount of lees time, you get
Hmm.
that complexity from the Meunier coming through first. While, for example, the Chardonnay is still quite shut down.
Huh. That's interesting. That
So
totally echoes things that I've heard from the Champenois. Not to compare you to champagne at all, but um, I have this
yeah.
interesting experience with our Meunier, some of which is kind of behind me here, that I don't know about development in the early years, but it certainly seems to age every bit as well as Pinot Noir once we get past a decade or so. Maybe they're, sort of doing this at first, but um, we see it age very well. Like 73 Pinot Meunier is, maybe to answer that question of Shane's, if I had to pick one Irie wine to drink for the rest of my life and I had enough of it, I would drink 73 Meunier. Um,
Wow. So coming up on a 50-year-old Meunier.
it's it's fresh as a daisy. It's crazy.
That's
Have you
amazing.
ever done a single variety cuvee from Meunier?
We inherited one, so there was 100% Pinot Meunier made in 2003 that
Uh,
showed really well, but it was a tiny thing. It was a couple thousand bottles and mostly sold by the time we arrived. Um, but yeah, so none of it's still around.
Too bad. It'd be interesting to
Yeah.
check in.
Yeah, yeah, but it is a great grape, and one that we a little bit less, well, a lot less loved than Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, in the winemaking community, I think, but super important for us. So
Well, I
yeah,
see I see Daniel Prince popping up there. I don't know if we've had the 73 together, but we did have the 75, so he can attest in person about that wine. Um,
and that must be. So you said around 1970, was it your first vintage?
70 was the first vintage. The Pinot Meunier was planted in 65, but I don't think it really gave us much of a crop until later. Um, we wound up with a clone of Pinot Meunier. It's not even called Pinot Meunier here; it's just called Meunier, and it's really old. Nobody knows where it comes from. It sort of popped into California in the 19th century sometime, and it's very shy yielding and has really high acid, and not super fruity when it's young. And I almost wonder if it's either a representative of like an heirloom style of Pinot Meunier,
Huh.
or if it's maybe somehow just a really different clone.
Yeah, and that is that the one I mean, it's still in the vineyard today. You mean
Yeah,
is it
yeah.
still?
And when I planted more, I went to look for certified stock, and you can from the University of California Davis collection, but it's been virus treated so many times that it's probably very different than what we put in.
Yeah. Huh. That's one. I mean, of our three, where clone doesn't seem to have such a big impact for us.
Mm,
So we've got a few. We've got four, I think, Pinot Meunier, um, but they differ by the sites. We have 10 vineyard sites. They don't all have Meunier on them, but the ones we've got Meunier planted on a few sites, and site definitely trumps clone when it comes to Meunier.
interesting.
So yeah.
Yep. Cool.
Anyway, I think yeah, we had plans, I think, for going about 20 minutes, and we've we've overshot that by a bit, but which you completely predicted. So this was really fun, Jason. Thanks for taking the time out of your day, and yeah, hopefully we can do a version of this in real life sometime soon on this side of the Atlantic or your side.
Well, I live right over by Domaine Serene, so if you ever come back to do another internship, just walk down the driveway.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, good.
Hey, I
Okay.
want to thank everybody who joined in here. Oh, somebody asked about Chardonnay. Can you see that question, Brad?
Yeah. So Jason, have you had an 87 Chardonnay recently? How is it? I bought a bottle not so long ago. Excited to try.
Oh, it's awesome. Break out the scallops. Um, you know, I don't think we went too long because we've been hovering about 20 people most of the time, so I think we did good. Thank you for
Yeah.
this wonderful idea, Brad. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. No, thank you for agreeing to be the first pancake.
Hey, I love it. Thank you. We'll see you later.
Okay. See you, Jason. Bye.
Bye bye.